Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kristen Lays, and I'm the Executive Director of Grove Plantation in Middletown, Virginia. Grove was the home of Major Isaac Hite Jr. and his first wife, Nellie Madison Hite, who is a sister of President James Madison, and his second wife, Anne Maury Hite. Isaac Hite, his parents, his aunts and uncles, and the families of his wives were enslavers. At Grove, the Hites enslaved 270 men, women, and children, including 26 individuals from Nellie's family home of Montpelier. This places Isaac Hite as the third and fourth largest enslaver in our region of the Northern Shenandoah Valley in what was historically Frederick County. When Hite's children grew up and moved out on their own, they were given enslaved people as part of their dowries or inheritances. And you will hear in today's presentation about Isaac Hite Jr. and his son, Isaac Fontaine Hite, who both owned members of the Jackson family. Grove has been an historic site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and been open to the public since 1967. The African American history of the site is significant and has been a major focus of our research, and especially in the last 8 years. Unfortunately, we are finding few stories where people who were enslaved here found freedom, so the Jackson family history is particularly exciting. The way we have discovered this history, with a clue here and a pivotal document there, has made it a true treasure hunt. We feel compelled to bring this previously erased history and very inspiring story to light. The research that's been done to date has included mostly publicly available documents, with only a few that have been written by the Jackson family members themselves. While the research has led us to information on living descendants of this family, it's a very large family, we have not yet reached out to those individuals, though we do plan to do so, and we will welcome their guidance and collaboration in this work. But just to be clear, today's presentation is results of what our researchers have done, and this does not speak for the family themselves. And we do not assume to speak for them either. Funding for this research and the online exhibit at virtual.belgrove.org was made possible through a grant from Virginia Humanities, which receives funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a racial justice mini grant from the Interpretation and Education Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, that was also funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Crescent City Charities, and the John H. Adamson III Memorial Fund. These funds are so vital to underwrite this kind of research. Grove is a very small organization with a small staff, and so to be able to hire consultant researchers and digital humanities experts such as Jessica, who you'll meet in a minute, are really, really important to us. And so we thank all of these sources for making this research possible. What will be presented today is the work of many researchers, including myself, Dr. H. Wayne Sulfridge, Richard Shaner, Shannon Mowick, Lucinda Lentz, Robin Young, Dr. Matthew Greer, Amy E.K. Arner of Arner Research in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Jane Ailes, and today's presenter, Jessica Pritchard Ritter. Jess is not only the creator of this online exhibit, but she retraced all the previous research that had been done, got additional information and insights, and as you will see, is an expert in organizing all this information. We are incredibly fortunate to have her as a collaborator in this work. Jess is a graduate of George Mason University's Digital Public Humanities program and has worked on projects at the Roy Rosenwig Center for History and New Media, including Pandemic Religion, a digital archive, and the Green Tunnel podcast. As a historian, her main goal is to teach, but her specialty is teaching via digital tools so that the past becomes present in an interactive, engaging, and creative way. She leverages her passion for digital history in her business, which is For the Love of History Consulting, LLC, where she conducts historical research and creates online educational exhibits for cultural institutions. And most of her research in recent years, we're very grateful, has been around some stories at Grove. So I am going to turn it over to Jess at this stage. Again, If you're just joining us, this is being recorded, and we will send you the link after the presentation has concluded. And we also will have time for questions, and you're welcome to just put those in the chat throughout the talk. And we will do our best to answer those. I'm getting a question about closed captioning. I will see if that's possible for me to turn on. I apologize, I did not do that in advance.
Thank you, Kristen. I clicked. We're really grateful that you guys are here. Like Kristen said, this has been a long time in the making. So let's get to it. The Jackson family, a story of resilience and the enduring love of family. Minimize you all. So Kristen did a brief overview of Grove Plantation's history for those of you who are new to the story or who haven't yet been able to visit the property. This is a modern day picture of the manor home. It was built between 1794 and 1797. And as Kristen mentioned, it was built by Major Isaac Height Jr. and his wife, Nellie Conway Madison Height. After Nellie passed away in 1802, Isaac remarried a young woman named Anne Tunstall Murray Height. And Anne lived there at Belle Grove until 1851, which was her death. And it's important to understand the key players, the key people who lived at Belle Grove, because they're the clues that really opened up the door to this whole story. So it's important to remember the names. But before we get into the Jackson family, I want to talk real briefly about digital humanities, because this project in particular is sort of a prime example of how powerful of a tool it can be. You can ask a whole bunch of people how to define digital humanities, and you'll get a ton of different interpretations. You can hear it called digital humanities, digital history. It's essentially taking your traditional academic methodologies and sharing them with quite literally a global audience. So you're using digital tools to share your research. So it could be anything from a basic Zoom function to the really cool interactive three-dimensional views of artifacts, to a little more analysis where you're looking at metadata or keywords at a collection of documents, and then you're able to identify trends. So there's a lot you can do using digital tools. I think the power and the beauty of digital humanities is this ability to take local stories that may not seem that big, right? They may seem small, but when you put them online and share them with the world, all of a sudden your stories become more robust, history becomes clearer, and your connections become more transparent. So how does that all relate to the Jackson project, the Jackson family project? Historians at Belle Grove found a digital project at the University of Pittsburgh called Free at Last. And in it is a collection of freedom papers, which is a digital collection of legal papers ranging from 1792 to 1857 that involve or include enslaved persons, free African Americans, emancipated enslaved persons, and or indentures. If you look closely, there's an entry for an Emmanuel Jackson Jr., which transcribes the purchase history of his freedom between his father, also Emmanuel Jackson, and the heirs of Major Isaac Height's estate. And so this single digitized historical document shared on the Free at Last project opened up this whole storyline that we're just now beginning to understand. So let's get to it. The Jackson family. It starts with an enslaved man named Emmanuel Jackson. He was also referred to as Manuel Jackson in some of the documents, and his partner, Hannah Thornton, who was an enslaved woman at Belle Grove. We know that together they had 6 children who were all enslaved, also at Belle Grove Plantation. They had 5 sons and 1 daughter. Emmanuel was born into enslavement, we think around 1786. It's been hard to pinpoint that date, but we think that it was around 1786 and very likely in Virginia. We're going to start with Emmanuel and Hannah because they really are, they're the matriarch and patriarch of the family from where we are right now with our research. So what you see here is actually the original manumission paper for Emmanuel. If you haven't yet had a chance to go to the online exhibit, I hope that you do. A lot of these documents are available through the exhibit, and you're able to to really zoom in and read the text. I do hope you'll do that if you haven't done so yet. So Emmanuel was enslaved by a man named Francis Maston in Middletown, Virginia until April 22nd, 1816, at which point Francis sold him to Jacob Brakebill of Shenandoah County, which is just one county south of where Middletown, Virginia is. And Emmanuel was enslaved for 5 more years after he was sold to Jacob, at which point they had an agreement where if Emmanuel agreed to pay an additional $25, which is about $530 in today's currency, he would be free. And so on November 5th, 1821, Emmanuel was a free man. But how did historians link Emmanuel Jackson to Hannah Thornton at Belle Grove? The short answer is through Frederick County tax records. So there are several Jackson listings in Frederick County records, and therefore a Manuel, Manuel Jackson, and an Emmanuel Jackson. At first glance, we thought we had the right person, but we did a little bit more digging. And Emmanuel is taxed for multiple horses, which indicates that he learned his living as a teamster, both as a free man and as an enslaved man. And it makes sense that since most of the Jackson family that we've traced up to Pittsburgh, they also made their living as teamsters. So it's sort of a family trade. But again, how does that link Emmanuel to Hannah? Hannah was the daughter of Frank Thornton and Abba. And they were Frank and Abba were an enslaved couple at Belle Grove, whose 12 children, 22 grandchildren, and a great-grandchild were all enslaved at Belle Grove. And the images here that you see are actually from Major Height's Commonplace book, which is a bound collection of notes that he kept from 1783 to 1851, which is when his second wife, Anne, died. In this collection of notes is a ledger of the men, women, and children that he enslaved at Belle Grove. And that ledger has become a real central source for our historical research as we try to understand the enslaved community at Belle Grove. But again, how did we get there? How did we make that connection? The Shenandoah Valley of Virginia was considered the frontier. And so you had your wealthy families that would buy their household goods, their tools, their clothing from what's today the Washington metropolitan area, right? The Washington, D.C. area. So they'd buy their goods from Alexandria, Virginia, from Baltimore, Maryland, and they would need to have them transported back to the valley, the Shenandoah Valley. A long journey like that would require someone you trusted and someone who knew the route well. These were typically African-American men, both enslaved and free. It's very possible that Emmanuel did this route from the valley to Washington, D.C. and back. And if that's the case, he very likely transported goods to and from Belle Grove Plantation. And in those travels, he very likely would have stayed overnight at one point or another. And given that the only place he would have been allowed to stay is in the enslaved housing, we're thinking that that would have been where Emmanuel and Hannah met. Their paths would have crossed. We don't know for sure, but what we do know for sure is that they met, they got together, and they did have several children. So that we know of, again, who were all born and enslaved at Belle Grove. So their eldest was Daniel, born in 1810, Adams, born in 1811, Mace in 1814, Emmanuel in 1815, Frank in 1818, and then their daughter, Betsy Ann, born in 1820. But Emmanuel received his freedom in 1821. And from there, he started a second family. He moved up to Charlestown, Virginia, which is now West Virginia today, and then ultimately up to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which we'll get to in just a minute. We think in Charlestown, he met and married a woman named Nancy, and together they had 3 children. They had 2 sons, Henry and Isaac, and a daughter, Louisa. It might seem on paper that he moved on, and I bring up the second family that he started after he was freed, because despite the fact that it seemed like he moved on, he really didn't. He never gave up on Hannah and their enslaved children at Belle Grove. And so despite the fact that he was in Charlestown, West Virginia, or Virginia, and then all the way up to Pittsburgh, he still was in contact with the Height family trying to buy the freedom of his family. And in the end, he was able to free Daniel, Emmanuel, Frank, Betsy Ann, and also Daniel's family, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But what happened to Hannah? We don't know. It's a mystery. When Major Isaac Height Jr.'s commonplace book was digitized, historians noticed 4 letters next to her name, S-O-L-D. It might be hard to make out on the PowerPoint. She was sold. We don't know when, we don't know to whom, we don't know where she went, but we know that she was sold. It's possible, although we don't know, Major Isaac Height had a big sale, essentially an estate sale, a liquidation sale in 1824, and it's possible that she was sold in that sale, but we don't know. There's a lot more research that needs to be done, and the harsh answer is we may never know, but we know she was sold. From here on out, much of the Jackson family story takes place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But what made Emmanuel choose Pittsburgh to settle down with his family? He originally settled in the Birmingham neighborhood of Pittsburgh, which is now in the south side of Pittsburgh. The city played an important role in the Underground Railroad since, as you can see on this map, it's the point where 3 rivers meet. You have the Allegheny, the Ohio, and the Monongahela River. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Pennsylvania was also a largely free state after the 1780 passing of the Act for Gradual Abolition of Slavery. So you have this primarily free state sharing a border with Virginia, whose economy relied very heavily on enslaved labor. So you had this really interesting dynamic there. According to census records, the entire state of Pennsylvania in 1810 had 800 enslaved persons recorded in census records. By 1850, which was shortly after Emmanuel, the patriarch, Emmanuel the Elder, moved his family to Pittsburgh, there were no recorded enslaved persons in the whole state of Pennsylvania. So it makes sense that he would move and settle up north to Pittsburgh. Let's start with Daniel. Daniel is, talk a little bit about Daniel. He's the eldest son of Emmanuel and Hannah, born into enslavement on January 2nd, 1810 at Belle Grove. Major Isaac Height dies in 1836, at which point Daniel is inherited by Isaac Fontaine Height, which Kristen mentioned is one of his sons. We know that while enslaved by Isaac Fontaine Height, Daniel met another enslaved woman named Matilda Gordon, and together they had 3 sons. Daniel remained enslaved by Isaac Fontaine until December 1846, when his father, Emmanuel, agreed to pay $650 to buy his son's freedom. That in today's currency is more than $25,000 to buy the freedom of his son, Daniel. Emmanuel wrote a letter to Isaac Fontaine Height on December 6th, 1846, regarding the purchase of Daniel. I'll give you just a minute to read the quote. This is just a quote from the letter. I have desired you to execute a bill of sale for my son as soon as you receive the money. Try not to make a habit of quoting in PowerPoint presentations, but I think that this quote is really important. Everybody loves a happy ending, and there are a lot of happy endings in the Jackson family, but I think it's really important that we make sure that we understand that this was a business transaction, and we're really fortunate to have, this is one of the only documents where we actually hear a Jackson family member's voice, right? And we need to make sure that we don't gloss over the fact that this was business. And so these letters are really insightful, but it's business, right? It's a transfer of, you're talking about a transfer of funds and a bill of sale. And I just want to make sure that we take a moment to really digest that. So Emmanuel's letter to Isaac Fontaine continues, and he confirms the financial and legal arrangements with Isaac and provides detailed travel instructions for Daniel. again, I hope you go online. We have the original letter and then also the transcription of the letter. Emmanuel's concern for Daniel's safety is really palpable. His anxiety is pretty palpable. So in the letter, he's providing which trains to take, how much money Daniel's going to need at each stop, how to handle catching the train in Cumberland, Maryland, to what food to prepare ahead of time. And there are several reasons, there are a couple of reasons why Emmanuel would be concerned. And again, you can feel it when you read the letter. First off, it's very likely that Daniel never left Middletown, Virginia, never left the area. So quite frankly, he just simply wouldn't know where to go, what to do, how to get there. So there's that component. But there's also this reality that Emmanuel knew the hardships that Daniel was going to face as an African-American traveling in 1846 America, right? He's going from an enslaved state, Virginia, and traveling to Pittsburgh, to a free state. So two things sort of at play that we can sort of glean from that. You have a father's love for his son, again, very palpable, but you also have this very legitimate concern for his safety during this trip from Middletown, Virginia, up to Pittsburgh. But he is free. So Daniel he makes it safely to Pittsburgh. This slide I'm going to stay on for longer than any other slide in the presentation, so bear with me. Less than a year later, Emmanuel writes another letter to Isaac Fontaine Height in October of 1847. And he's asking Isaac Fontaine, will you sell Daniel's family to me? I'm going to offer you $1,000 for them. As of yesterday, my interpretation of this information was that Emmanuel was asking to buy the freedom of Daniel's wife, Matilda, and their eldest son, Emmanuel, who was born in 1842, which would have made him around 4. And that in and of itself is really powerful. He's asking to buy his daughter-in-law and his grandson. Shannon Mowick yesterday, she's a park ranger at Cedar Creek and Belgrove National Historic Park. She did a deep dive on their middle son, Robert, and pulled all of the data that we've collected. And it's one thing to read sort of in isolation, but when you pull it all together, we, through conversations, Robert was actually, their middle son was born in Virginia in 1846, which makes you go, so really when Emmanuel wrote Isaac, he was offering $1,000 for Matilda and their 4-year-old son, Emmanuel, and also their 1-year-old son, Robert. And then take it even further. And they had one more son, Lewis William. And Lewis William, we know, was born on April 15th, 1848, which means that he was conceived in July of 1847. So then all of a sudden there's that string and Shannon pulled it. And all of a sudden we realize that he's not just asking to buy the freedom of Matilda and Emmanuel, but he's asking to buy his 4-year-old grandson, his 1-year-old grandson, and his pregnant daughter-in-law. So and I mention this because I think it's important to understand how complicated these stories are to tell. And we're very fortunate to have so many resources, but it's still very porous. And I would argue most history is porous. We're doing the best we can to understand it. But we can look at the same document, the same series of documents over and over, and each time we pull out something else. And so as recently as last night, we're going, wait, it's actually far heavier. There's far more to this one letter than we even realized. So I just wanted to give it its moment to realize how heavy it was and how complicated these stories are to tell. So, and then at the very end of this letter, Emmanuel says, my son is anxious to see his family. And that in and of itself is powerful when we thought it was just Matilda and Emmanuel. But then when you realize that his whole family, his pregnant wife and their 2 sons are enslaved by Isaac Fontaine Height, I have chills even telling you now because it's 24 hours ago that we sort of realized it was much more robust. So I won't talk this long on any other slide, but I think it's really important that we give we unpack this document because it's such a quintessential moment of what our work is behind the scenes to try to begin to tell a story like this. But they made it to Pittsburgh, so it's happy. So they made it to Pittsburgh. This is an 1860 census record. So you see Daniel, he's a carter. So again, he's in that family business of being a teamster. You see Matilda, Emmanuel, Robert, and William. So everybody's reunited. They're living in Pittsburgh. One of the things that the online exhibit delves into a bit further is the wealth of the Jackson family once they settled in Pittsburgh and then beyond, as the younger generations moved away, as younger generations tend to do. For Daniel and Matilda, their wealth did come from their teamster business. There's a lot of data, again, online, a lot of census data that you can definitely delve into. But one of the things that I want to point out here is that in the 1870 census, Daniel is listed as a teamster, and he reports the highest estate value of any of his neighbors, any of his white neighbors. He and Matilda are the only Black family in their surrounding block, right? So each census page, you sort of can gauge the neighbors that were around them. They were the only Black family. And by 1880, which is just 1 year before Daniel died, his occupation is actually listed as old gent, which is really interesting. So this map that you see here is actually an 1890 atlas of the city of Pittsburgh. And the two blue blocks are Daniel's property. And the pink of the buildings indicates that they were either brick or stone. And this is a modern Google shot, so you can see that the square is still there, and you have the two blocks where his properties are. And I'm going to try this. I hope this works. I'm going to take you on a virtual roller coaster ride and drop you into the block where Daniel's homes were. So bear with me. I've practiced this a lot, so hopefully it works. Spin you around. We're going to go forward. I'm going to go ahead, and then I'm going to spin you around one more time. Bear with me, roller coaster. So this is 13th Street. Spin you around. This here is 13th Street, going longwise, and we're virtually standing on Bingham Street. These are the two corners where Daniel and Matilda lived. We have a lot of maps, we have a lot of addresses. I chose to do a virtual drop-in on this block because they're brick, and based on the 1890 atlas, it's very likely that these are the original buildings, but it's another behind the scenes look because there's more research to be done. And that's what I think there's just this running log of notes of more to research. But I think to be able to see these buildings, know that they're old, there's no denying that they're old. It's just really neat to be able to do that. And to think that these may very well be the original buildings. And this one is, I think, really neat. You sort of see the scars and you know there's a story here. We haven't gotten to it yet. So go back to PowerPoint. Daniel died on September 6th, 1881. He was 71 years old. And this snapshot here is actually a clipping from his death certificate. And we think that he died a teamster's. His primary occupation, or his primary cause of death, was upsetting of wagon. And the secondary cause was fracture of ribs and pneumonia. So again, we think that he died a teamster's death. It was just a horse and wagon accident, very likely. And again, his occupation is listed as gentleman. So Daniel and Matilda's story is really robust, and I hope you'll read even more about it online in the exhibit. I'm going to skip over Adams and Nace, and I'll talk about them in just a few minutes and talk about Emmanuel. And he's really the catalyst for this project for us. Again, if you go to the Free at Last website, which I hope you do, you'll be able to really engage with the freedom paper for Emmanuel. And this is just a screenshot of it. right before Major Isaac Height died, he had an agreement with Emmanuel, the patriarch, Emmanuel the elder, to sell Emmanuel, his son, for $800, which is more than $27,000 today. But Major Height died in 1836. He died before they could execute their agreement. But luckily, the heirs, Major Isaac Height's heirs, including Anne Tunstall Murray Height, decided to honor their agreement. And on February 3rd, 1841, Emmanuel was a free man. Although we don't know exactly when or how Emmanuel met his wife, Catherine, we do know that they met at some point between his emancipation and 1850, because by 1850, they're living in Pittsburgh with their two young children, Anne, age 3, and Robert, age 1. And based on our research, which again is still ongoing, I cannot reiterate that enough, we think that they had a total of 6 children. We think they had 4 sons and 2 daughters. There's been this question, did Emmanuel serve in the Civil War? Historical data points to yes. We found a record and profile for a Manuel Jackson, Manuel Jackson, and he was a private in the 30th United States Colored Infantry Regiment, Company G. He enlisted on March 31st, 1864, and he was discharged on December 10th, 1865. That alone wouldn't be enough for us to say, yeah, that's our guy, right? Like that's the same Emmanuel who was born at Belle Grove. But what you see here is actually a pension record for Emmanuel Jackson. And there are 2 pieces of data that made us go, well, together with the other record we found, we feel pretty confident. You have obviously Emmanuel Jackson, but then his widow is Catherine Jackson, and Catherine is spelled Catharine, and that's consistent with the way Catherine spells her name in most of the documents we've found about her, and that's not a spelling you see that often. And again, if that was isolated, maybe it wouldn't be enough to go on, but the branch of service is also the same. So again, you sort of have these breadcrumbs and a lot of analysis, and so it is very likely that this is the same Emmanuel Jackson who was born into enslavement and then also fought in the Civil War. We're unsure of when exactly Emmanuel died, but his will is dated May 16th, 1870. And in it, he says that his daughters, Anne and Catherine, are each to receive $500, which is $11,375 today. So they would each receive that from his estate. And then his sons, Frank and Robert, would receive real estate. The image that you see here is actually Catherine's widow's appraisement, and it's dated October 18th, 1870. And it lists all of the personal property that she inherited from Emmanuel after his death, including a horse, household furnishings, linens, cooking utensils, and all of that totaled $167.20, which is about $3,800 in today's currency. Emmanuel's life and Daniel's life, his brother, it's really incredible. They were both born into enslavement, but over the course of their life, they owned property, they ran their own business, and they were able to have this transfer of wealth to their family. In the year that he died, 1870, Emmanuel's wife, Catherine, reported that their real estate value was $8,000, which is $182,000 today. Emmanuel and Hannah's 4 other children, Adams, Nace, Frank, and Betsy Ann, we don't know as much about them. I'm going to share with you what we do know, though. Adams was born in December of 1811, and we don't know much about him. We think that he may have been sold in the 1824 sale. Again, that's when Major Isaac Height Jr. was cutting back on his agricultural operations, and he was liquidating a lot of his farm equipment, his livestock, and his enslaved people. Nace Jackson was born on January 22nd, 1814, which was recorded in the commonplace book, along with 4 letters. And I'm not sure if you can see it here to the right, D-E-A-D. So we don't know we don't know when or how Nace died, but we do know that there were 4 other children who died back to back from June, July, and September 1814. So it's possible that there was an outbreak of some sort at the plantation, or possibly in the community. Frank Jackson was born on June 22nd, 1818, the youngest son of Emmanuel and Hannah. And according to the Commonplace book, Emmanuel, his father, actually bought his freedom sometime between 1827 and 1830. We don't know the details, we don't know the price, and we don't know where he went. We don't know what happened to Frank, where he lived, if he had family, who that family may have been, where or when he died. We don't know that. And the same goes for his sister Betsy Ann, the youngest. She was born May 31st, 1820, again at Belle Grove. And we know that she too was bought by Emmanuel, her father. Same situation, likely between 1827 and 1830. But what happened to her after she left Belle Grove, we don't know. And the harsh reality is we may never know. But this is where we are presently in our research. That was a lot. We try to cap off all of our online exhibits with learning activities that tie into the story, because they're always full of teachable moments. So the first one is to build a family tree, and this can be anyone from a kindergartner on up, so sort of your basic steps, but hopefully it's encouraging students to connect with their ancestry, learn how to start to analyze historical data, historical resources, and then of course the ultimate goal is to be able to connect with history using your own family's history to sort of figure out how your little corner of the world ties into the bigger historical context. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, this is what allowed the federal government to return any enslaved persons to their enslaver, even if they were found in a free state. So this is sort of in the background of the Jackson family, especially in the very beginning, where they're making that journey from Middletown, Virginia up to Pittsburgh. So PBS put together a lesson for students from grades 6 through 12 that actually uses their TV show Mercy Street to teach about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So we didn't reinvent the wheel. It's a really well done package for teachers, but it's also very relevant for our exhibit. And then the very last activity is to think like a historian. And in our online exhibit, because there are so many moments, there are so many complexities to this story that again we're still dealing with in real time. There are sections that are called Think Like a Historian, and it sort of gives you a behind the curtain look of how we tackle this data, the questions we ask, and how we try to fill in, sort of backfill with our knowledge. So Think Like a Historian, this activity asks students to go back to the Freedom Papers, pick a name from their collection of Freedom Papers, and then try to pull out the data and see what you can find. So it may be a bust, right? Like we have 4 of Emmanuel and Hannah's children that we don't know. We know very little about them. So even this is what we do for a living, and we still are hitting walls, and that's okay. But it's trying to encourage students to teach them how to analyze your primary sources, how to conduct some basic genealogical research, and then trying to use that data, make informed decisions, ask those hard questions, and participate in historical thinking. That's always the goal, right? As an educator, as a historical educator. That was a lot. I know it's a really big story. So what questions do you guys have?
So feel free to put any questions you have in the chat and we'll ask Jess about them. I'm trying to think of one to ask you, Jess, that's come up a lot.
Sure.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks to Hillary for your comment about the learning activities. That is something we have tried to do. Again, I'll let you know if you haven't looked already. Virtual.belgrove.org is the hub that Jess has helped us create. She's got an online exhibit about Anne Height, and she has an exhibit about another enslaved woman who lived at Belgrove at the time of the Civil War, and the connection. So that sort of unpacks some oral history documentation we have. And then an online exhibit about, I'm forgetting the last one.
Okay, we have Anne Tunstall, Murray Height, Mary Briscoe Baldwin.
Oh yes, Mary Briscoe Baldwin.
Lucy Walker.
Yeah, Mary Briscoe Baldwin was a granddaughter of the Heights, and she was the first female missionary to go overseas as a single woman for the Episcopal Church. So her story is very interesting too. Hillary asked also, have you ordered Emmanuel's full pension packet yet? So I'm guessing that's something you request from the National Archives. Hillary, I think we'd be interested in getting the details on how that would be done. We haven't gone down there, and I was looking quickly this morning to see if I could find a regimental history of Company G. It'll sometimes show rosters and give you some other clues about what kind of action those companies saw and where they were from. So, okay, so Gail's going right to the heart of it. We've noticed this too. So she says the documents show that Jacksons may have mixed race. Are there any chance of connecting the Jackson descendants for DNA to track their European ancestors? There is a chance. We have, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, this research has allowed us to make some pretty extensive family trees, and those actually take us to present day into living descendants. And so if that was something of interest to that family, that certainly could be something we find out. We're always very careful when reaching out to living descendants to make sure they're in control. They get to decide how much information they want to know. They get to decide if they want to be publicly known to anybody. We're happy to work with anybody completely confidentially if that is their preference. So that's something that's really important to me in working with living descendants. The question that I'll just go ahead and just tell you the question, the elephant that's always in the room, is it possible that the Jackson family shared DNA with the Height family? That also is entirely possible. The Height family and Belgrove have a close connection. We have direct descendants that are white. They have done their DNA research. Their DNA data is freely available online. So at any time, a person could study their DNA and be able to compare results to theirs. And so their patrilineal line has been well documented. So yes, Elon asked if any living descendants seen the exhibit or have been involved with the exhibition's development or interpretation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, no. We made one outreach to one member, and that didn't lead to anything. But in doing this research, we now have at least 7 or 8 people that we possibly can reach out to. And that is a really important next step in the work, is to reach out to individuals to see if they want to be involved and be collaborators or guide this future research and its publication. Let me scroll back through some other questions. Thank you, Linda. She said, this project's another example of the importance of teaching cursive to today's children. Amen. It is really important. We're actually been collaborating with, where Belgrove is in a national park, Cedar Creek and Belgrove National Historical Park. We've just been collaborating with the rangers on a junior ranger booklet that's really beautifully designed and had some script writing that they realized they better change to print writing because kids today can't read that. And yes, the future transcribers of the world, that's going to be really, really important. Yes, thanks, Hillary. She gave us a link to how we could, through the National Archives, can maybe order the full pension package for Emmanuel Jackson. to learn more about his Civil War service. Any other questions or comments? If you prefer to go off mute to voice those, that's fine. So as Jess has mentioned a couple of times during the presentation, it's a very emotional topic for all of us we've been researching. We were really fortunate, and this is just a plug for anybody on the call who does family genealogy or research. The fact that one white family had papers that told us specifics about the sale of Daniel and his family. And the fact they put that in a public archive was really a key break in the story, if you will. And so I encourage you and anyone you might know who has any documentation to do with enslavement in their families or their friends' families to do what they can to make it publicly available, to put it in a local repository where it can be found by researchers, because that was just an important break in our case. And well, we haven't identified that family in this talk, but we are very, very grateful to them for having made saving those records and making those records available, because we wouldn't have really been able to trace as much as we were able to without that. I'm gonna look at a couple more questions. And thanks, Angelique. If you have any friends in Pittsburgh that want to go out and look at those historic buildings or pick up the trail and do any more research for us, we would welcome that. We were so fortunate to work with a genealogist, Amy Arner, who's based in Pittsburgh, that really helped us get through a lot of documents to learn about where the family's final resting place is. And so we have learned quite a lot. This online exhibit and Jess's presentation really scratches the surface. There are even more interesting and exciting stories that we hope to be able to develop and put out online. Again, with hopefully with some help of descendants if they're interested and they're willing. Elon is pointing us to the Teaching Hard History podcast and online materials. And that would be something that would be great for us to look into as a link in our educational suggestions. Beth, who lives in Pittsburgh, recognized the South Side neighborhood. And she would be happy to drive there to locate those exact residences. And we appreciate that, Beth. Please stay in touch. info@belgrove.org is a great email to keep in touch with us. And yes, Angelique also from Pittsburgh is chiming in to say that the South Side buildings are in a historic district. So yes, so if there's anyone we can connect to who helps manage that historic district where this information might lead to any preservation of those buildings, we appreciate it very much. We're glad to share our information. That's the other beautiful thing about the online exhibit is that, and Bill Grove has this ethic as well, any information that we find, I mean, it's not easy for us to put it online, just put many, many hours into making this an exhibit that's easy to navigate and understand. So it is a lot of work to make it publicly available online, but we consider any research we do to be public information. This is not something that we are holding back in any way. So again, if any family member would be interested in our data, we're happy to share it. And we share as much as we can freely online. So what we hope is that, somebody in the middle of the night is up late, can't sleep, and they're Googling and they come across perhaps a family history they didn't know about, or a part of their town, like our friends in Pittsburgh. Okay, so I'll give you one last chance for questions. And then I'll leave you with a tantalizing, hope you don't mind, Jess, but just a little tantalizing trail. Daniel had a son. It's very complicated because the family names repeat. But Daniel had a son named Emmanuel, and several members of the family went into the undertaking business, which is very interesting to think about, because that it was a very segregated profession. There were African American undertakers and funeral homes that did that service for their community. And it seems that a number of members of the Jackson family transitioned from being Teamsters into that business. And again, that was also a pretty common transition for the undertaking business, which really had its birth after the Civil War. So the Civil War and the deaths that unfortunately it produced changed funerary practices in the United States. And the Jackson family, would have gone from hauling maybe as a hearse and into that business. So that put them into a prominent position in their community in Pittsburgh, and ultimately a branch of that family moved to Chicago and also went into the undertaking business. And the Jackson Funeral Home on the south side of Chicago became an institution, to the point that when some of these Jackson descendants passed away, their obituary was in Jet magazine in the 1960s. So very prominent African-American community members there. And so that's an example of historic preservation as well. We've been made aware that that business is out of business. It was sold out of the family. And I can find on Google Maps, just like Jess did today, the Jackson Funeral Home as a shell of a building. It's been written up by local historic preservationists in south side of Chicago as a blighted building that possibly should be saved. But one of our next steps too is try to connect back with the folks in Chicago to show them that the family history actually goes back to this very inspiring story, and hopefully again underscores the need to preserve some of these buildings. So I'll leave you with that tantalizing hook. That's a whole nother page or two at least on the online exhibit. I will say, somebody asked, is it possible to make a donation towards this type of work? And it is. If you go to belgrove.org, you'll see at the top of the page a donate button, leads you to PayPal, and it should ask if you have a note for us. It says note to seller, which is a little misleading, but in that note, you could say that you would like your donation to go directly to this type of research, and would be happy to acknowledge that and to designate that. But we are also, again, I want to underscore the wonderful funding we've had from various entities, including the National Trust, Virginia Humanities, and a private fund those are memorial gifts made in honor of one of Belgrove's longstanding board members, board chair, and a passionate fan of our African-American historical research, John Adamson. Those monies do make it possible for us to hire Jess and get her great expertise, but also to make this freely available, so that there is no paywall on this kind of information. Thank you, Elon, for the Heart History link. We'll look into that for sure. And we are just about at 1 o'clock. So I thank you so much for your kind time and attention, willingness to attend this presentation. We had 65 people on the call today, and we will have the recording available online, and we'll send you that link if you would like to share it with anybody else. Thank you again, Jess, for your presentation and all your work. And thank you to all the researchers who made this possible.